First, thank you all for coming. And I'd like to first thank the Havens Center for Social Justice and also the Center of East Asian Studies for making this event possible. And also, of course, Wang Hui for coming. So first, it gives me great pleasure to introduce our speaker today, Professor Wang Hui, who is Professor of Chinese and History at Tsinghua University and also Director of their Institute for Advanced Studies. This year, he is a fellow for advanced studies at Princeton. He's received numerous awards. And in 2008, the US magazine Foreign Policy named him one of the top 100 public intellectuals in the world. Wang Hui is a prolific author whose work spans a variety of disciplines. So I'm just going to mention some. He began his career as a scholar of literature, specifically Lu Xun, in his first book, published in the late 80s, was Resisting Despair. I've recently been republished this year. And this book transformed the field by pointing out how Lu Xun could be read as someone who had once affirmed and criticized. This book also outlined Lu Xun's relation to German thinkers such as Max Stirner and Friedrich Nietzsche. He then wrote numerous articles and books on both literature and intellectual history. However, perhaps the most important is his magnum opus, which is The Rise of Modern Chinese Thought, which is a 4-volume work in Chinese, which appeared in 2004 in Chinese. Last year, an abridged English translation appeared, published by University Press, which is a little shorter, so only 1,000 pages. So it's longer than most genealogies of modern Chinese thought, because instead of starting from the 19th or 20th century, or even the 17th and 18th century, Wang's book begins with the transformations taking place around the 6th century BCE with Confucian thought. He then engages various debates concerning pre-modern Chinese history, all in some way touch on issues of early modernity, and the reconstitution of Chinese identity in relation to the non-Han ethnicities. Now, the specter of the Chinese Revolution looms over this book because Wang uncovers some of the political, ethical, and conceptual conditions for the possibility of radical social movements. Marxists were surprised with this book, narrative, because it ends in the 1930s, but did not deal with any Marxists or the Chinese Revolution. But since 2004, Professor Wang has constantly addressed the problem of revolution and socialism and has developed a distinctive repertoire of dialectical concepts with which to understand the complex history of revolution. These concepts include trans-systemic society and trans-societal systems, the politics of depoliticization, and China's short 20th century. But this brings us to one of the topics of Wang's talk today. And so without further ado, please join me in welcoming our speaker today.
I'm happy to know some new friends and some older friends here. The last visit, my visit to Wisconsin was 30 years ago. That was really long ago still, but it's interesting experience. And I have a PowerPoint, but I also prepare a manuscript too. And partly because I know that among our audience, some of them, they are not necessarily in the Chinese studies or the history.
And PowerPoint, is it?
It's already here. It's already, so I will use part of PowerPoint and also following my readings of my text too. Somewhere I will stop here and to show some materials and to see that. Okay. So here we talk about the dawn of Pacific century for China. And for me, actually, it's almost the first century for China because we never use that term, the century. So the first question, how to understand China's historical heritage in the 20th century and its position in world history? That's the basic question. China's short 20th century is a broad, complex, profound, and intense process, and its changes are unprecedented in density, depth, and breadth. From language and writing to science and technology, from state building to social organizations, from political systems to cultural movements and educational reform, from labor, gender, and other issues to cultural fashions, from urban-rural relations to the regional relations, from religious beliefs to the social ethics. There is probably a field that has not undergone profound changes. Today, it is hard for people to imagine a life that has not been transformed in the 20th century. Without the exploration of revolution, innovation, and the failures in the century, we cannot grasp the significance of this era to us. The birth of the century marks the birth of global synchronicity for me in Chinese history, as well as the struggle and exploration to reform the imbalance within these synchronic relationships. Only from the double perspectives of Chinese historic context and the great changes in the world history can we grasp the position of China in the 20th century. So here, but however, in China, we know that so many years, we are still struggle in how to define, how to interpret the 20th century. It's one of the most controversial issues. At least here, some typical questions about that. Farewell to revolution is more or less is an echo to the thesis of end of history here. It's almost a negative reaction to the century, right? So some radicals will argue that the century already exists, that in the first page of the Alain Badiou, who labeled himself as a post-Maoist philosopher. And he basically argued that no matter how you attack the century already existed. So it's a challenge. It's a very challenging, provocative gesture for defending that legacy of the revolution in the 20th century. And for him, that generation, 68ers generation, I think. But then from the end of the 70s to 80s, a lot of historians following the trend for the local history, for arguing the continuity of the Chinese history. Basically, because 20th century as an age of revolution claim itself is unprecedented. However, more and more historians will argue that actually you can find a lot of the continuities between the 20th century and the early history. I cite here the Philip Bouquet's the concept, which means that a process determined by its internal historical development. So it's how that we can see that the controversial and the different ideas. So, however, my first question is, what is the 20th century in Chinese context? So that is at the end of the 19th century and the beginning of 20th century, under the influence of great change, different forces form their own judgments on the current situation, which also led to the mutual competition in the view of time. When we talk about the century, first is a concept of time, which came from the Christianity, that the idea much earlier. So before that, we talk about the debates on the 20th century. It's not only the debates in the context of China, but also in the West too. And we know this is a very famous argument by the Hobsbawm, the age of the extremes. So that's the defining of the short 20th century from the European position as a period of the 1914 to the end of the Cold War. So that was covered First World War, Second World War, Cold War, and then the collapse of the Soviet Union. So that's why he said that the century, extremes of century actually overlap with one country's destiny, that was Soviet Union. So how to define in this kind of the global map, how to define the position of China or in Asia or non-Western regions in this context? So that's the question. Actually, from my point of view, that's at the beginning of the 20th century, this is a new alien idea. So what is this? At that time, the different forces as have formed their own judgments on the current situation, which also led to the mutual competition in the view of time. For example, very famous, the reformer and Kang Youwei actually put forward the Confucian Chronicle in the preface to Ritual of Luck, Li Yunzhu. And Liu Shipei put forward the Chronicle of the Yellow Emperor in 1903. Even now, some new Confucian scholars try to retrieve that chronicle of so-called Confucian calendars together. These views of time contradicted each other, but they share a new sense of progress. That is the unity of history and the time axis. In the 1900, is the year of Genzi, Boxer uprising, and the intervention of 8 powers in China, and the 26 years of Guangxu. At midnight on the January 30th of this year, the Liang Qichao, another very famous reformer, exiled in Japan, and then he went to Hawaii. So in the end of the January, he wrote a very famous long poetry. Here, I will show you the poetry here. The Song of the 20th Century Pacific Ocean. So that is a very interesting long poetry. In that long poetry, he gave a global map in that moment. That, for me, that was the first, maybe some people use that term, the century or so on and so forth. But that was the first time one person from China tried to combine the idea of time, that the century, together with a new idea of space, the Pacific, together. So exactly in January, the end of the January, he was there. Why he wrote this kind of the poetry? Because he was, in 1898, after the failure of the reform, he exiled in Japan. There, he read a lot of the Western books through the Japanese read the Japanese texts, and a lot of the resources there. And then he really want to go visit America. He had a very admiration for the new republic in the world history for him. So he went to America. He wanted to, at the invitation from Sun Yat-sen, later became the first president that the Republic of China. When he arrived in Honolulu, he was stopped by his teacher, Kang Youwei, because he is more conservative. He don't want to be radical. He wants to take care of things there for their groups. So he stopped there. But that time was very special in Hawaii. That was the period after American-Spanish War. So when the Hawaii was formally merged into America, together with Guam and some other places in Pacific. So he obviously perceived this new situation, the rise of America as a Pacific power, as well as not mentioned already there, Japan. Two new powers emerged. And then he realized that the rise of Germany and a lot of the wars happened, and here and there. So interestingly enough, in this poetry, what was the idea of time? He tried to combine the Confucian idea, so-called the Gongyang theory of 3 ages. and the European idea of history of civilization. So he divided the whole history into the three stages. The first is the age of rivers, China, India, Egypt, Asia Minor. That's very Asian. And then the age of continental sea, the Mediterranean Sea, Baltic Sea, Arabic Sea, and the Yellow Sea, as well as Bohai. And the age of great ocean after Columbus, the time of national imperialism. He used the term national imperialism. According to the Confucian Gongyang theory, basically you from the 居乱世, the Celtic age, and they much a little bit peaceful period, and they great harmony, the age of great harmony. But it's interesting enough, he used that term, 居乱世, to define the first age. 小康氏 defined the second age. Then when he talked about the age of ocean, he completely lost. They don't know how to use the traditional term to define this age because no great harmony at all. Obviously, at that time, China was facing most serious challenges and a deep crisis. So in that sense, even more dangerous than so-called chaos age. So in that sense, that's why he employed a new term, and it was the 20th century. So he combined the 20th century together with the age of Pacific. That's why I say that the dawn of the Pacific age. So these are some basic. So which put together two important new concepts. One is the 20th century, which represents time, and the other is Pacific Ocean, which represents space. The new concept of time and space, which is different from previous expression, will become a more common expression in the future, providing a new space-time framework for exploring the historical position of China in the 20th century. For Liang Jichao, the century is not only the way of chronology, but also the cognition and the definition of historical situation, the judgment of the basis of action. So all understandings of the past, present, and the future are regrouped in this drastic change of historical consciousness. Although the concept of 20th century was born in the entanglement with Confucian narratives, such as the Confucian Gongyang theory of three ages, it was the product of the nature that the theory of three ages or other classical historical narratives couldn't cope with the great changes of this era. That's why Wang Hui used the Confucian calendars, or Liu Shubei tried to use yellow emperor calendars, was gone. So later, the idea of the century became universal. Now, so the universalization of the concept of century is due to the new times. From the perspective of space, the Pacific era is closely related to the rise of the United States from the late 19th century. The center of gravity of global capitalism began to shift from Atlantic Ocean to the Pacific Ocean. In this vast space, in addition to the old empires in the 19th century, two new political economies, namely United States and Japan, emerged. As a result, the world has changed dramatically, and China and its destiny in the 20th century are closely related to these great changes. Even now proved to be true. China in the 20th century is the first time in Chinese history to define itself by the century. The judgment of the nature of China's times is closely related to the observation of the whole world pattern. Liang Jichao's Song of the 20th Century Pacific and the great genius of 20th century, the trust. So in 1903, he came to mainland America to observe. He tried to observe the election, the political system, democracy. He's admired a lot. But on the other hand, what attracted him was the new form and a new organization of production. That was the trust. Because basically he wanted to understand why in this age, what kind of different driving force for the expansionism. He thought that was economy, new economic logic. So the surplus of production and so on and so forth. So here I write, the rise of trust was meant to redeem the evil of surplus production. The trusts became increasingly intricate in organization and the increasingly appropriate in management, which increased the amount of property in the US by several times. The American trust was a consequence of excess productivity, and American imperialism, the consequence of the excess capital since the establishment of the trusts, both ineffective as remedies. So that was his observation. Very important observation. If we put it into the genealogy of the theory of imperialism, we found a lot of, here I show you, is not only Liang's writing, but also a lot of the overseas Chinese observation. There were most of them living in Japan. Published, these are the magazines published by overseas students in Japan. They also talk about on the development of imperialism and the future of the truth. So here, you can see these are some other journals. But one of the interesting phenomena was the Kotokushioshi writing. He's the founding member of the social democracy in Japan, right? So that was in 1901. He published the first book on imperialism. So the monster in the 20th century, imperialism. This is the title. And then we know that very famously, it's Hobson's book, 1902. That was a classic of imperialism. A study, 1902. And Paul Lavac, who was the Farmark's son-in-law, who also at exactly the same year, 1903, when Liang Qizhao was in America, wrote that long treatise on the trust. The same year, Paul Lavac published pamphlets in French. That was the American trust. So then the Hivatin's financial capital, 1910. Then Karl-Kautsky's super imperialism, and then Lenin's imperialism. Of course, Otto Bauer, Bakrin's important essays on Luxembourg, published around the 1913. All of these documents could be thought as a sequence of the new ideas on the 20th century. Imperialism is not only an expansionary economic and military system, but also the ideology and the value pedigree, which infiltrates various narratives about others and the self with the help of a set of expansionary knowledge. The consciousness of the century is not only the conscious of this process, but also strongly contests resistance to the process. So on the one hand, there's universalization of these. But on the other hand, for those revolutionaries, they also try to employ this idea to resist from within that whole system. So in that sense, the arrival of the century is an event. The use of this time concept is precisely to terminate the old time concept, so that the 20th century cannot naturally derive or develop from the previous time concept. It's not the natural unfolding process at all. It is impossible to explain these concepts from the time series, such as Dynasty Chronicle, the Yellow Emperor's Chronicle, or the Confucius Chronicle. It is also impossible to grasp these concepts from the time series of 18th century, 19th century, and the 20th century, but all other time concepts will be reconstructed into the pre-20th century history in this era. So if we read the historical books now, we all talk about the early histories as a prehistory of the 20th century. Before that, you have no such kind of the chronology and no such time narrative at all. So the concept of the century provides a framework of epistemology, bringing multi-space and multi-time into the universal history of synchronicity. So, and thus, peoples began to think about the imbalance within this universal history and the resulting contradictions and the conflicts. The distinction between the 20th century and all previous eras is not a distinction in general time, but a grasp of a unique current situation, the moment. At these unique historical moments, people have to think about the European and the global issues in 18th century, 19th century, or even earlier periods for creating our own prehistory for modern China. To identify China's unique position in the global perspective. For example, you need to think about the American Revolution. You need to think about the French Revolution, British Revolution. You need to think about the Japanese reform, Meiji reform, and later, of course, the Russians reform and so on and so forth. They did think about all these issues, like a Boer War in South Africa, and also the Turkish Revolution or other places, what happened, all need to be reorganized into our own understanding as a so-called prehistory of the 20th century. So these are the war and the revolutions. The 19th century in Europe is the central axis of modern historical narration. In many historical and theoretical discussions, the 19th century almost completely overlaps with the concept of modernity. With the British-French dual revolution as the hub and the capitalist narrative of the modernity as the foundation, the European Revolution, capital empire, and its ups and downs constitute the central stories. Changes in other parts of the world are subordinate to this central story. Compared with the long 19th century, the 20th century is still a short extreme era. World War I, World War II, ethnic cleansing, Cold War, tyranny, and so on and so forth. All social experiments ended in a failure. Hobsbawm once lamented, the 20th century is consistent with the fate of a country. This country is the Soviet Union. In this narrative, what is the position of China and other non-Western countries? The rise of new imperialism, the pattern of great powers contending for and jointly dividing up colonies, and the shift of global power centered to the Pacific Ocean constitute the historical conditions for understanding the basic problems of 20th century. As far as the phenomenon of imperialism is concerned, from China's point of view, it is difficult for us to draw a clear line between the 1840 to the 1870, like many classical writers who studied the imperialism. You know that Lenin, Hivatin, and all those people thought that 1870s was demarcation. This is a liberal era and the imperial era that was all different. Liberal and socialists are all agree with that. However, it's difficult to define that from the Chinese perspective. What the difference between the Opium War or Sino-French War? One is in 80s, one is in 40s. So what's the difference? So it's difficult to define that. With the transfer of the capitalist center of the world, the birth of the 20th century was accompanied by a series of revolutions in the peripheral areas. What really draw a clear distinction between the 20th century and the 19th century was the revolution in the non-Western regions bred by the internal and external conditions of the imperialism era. what really constitutes the novelty of this new period is not only the story of capitalism spreading from the central region to the whole world, but for the economic development, political independence, and the cultural survival of colonies and semi-colonies, the resistance to the imperialist hegemony, and the transformation of internal social relations that hindered above-mentioned goals were continuously carried out. And the exploration of new social forms and generated in this process of resistance and the transformations. So it's from that point of view, it's very difficult, as I said, that make a clear distinction as historians and social theorists, marked by the liberal period and the later imperialist period. However, these are the new for the 20th century. A series of the revolutions happened in the world, which different from the French Revolution or the British Revolution, which mainly occurred in the center area of capitalism. It's all the revolutions happened in the peripheral regions, and mainly in Asia, and also in Latin America. That's why here I list all these revolutions. For example, the era of the war and the revolution. If we want to understand the changes of China in 20th century through the war itself, we must ask what characteristics of China's war forms have in this era. There were important differences between the Northern Expedition War, Agrarian Revolutionary War, War of Resistance against Japan War, and the Liberation War and the wars of previous 20th century. That was like an Opium War, Sino-French War, Sino-Japanese War, that war between the new imperialist country and the old empire. But this is a new war in the 20th century of revolution through the war, and a war of building a revolutionary country in the war. So highly politicized, and together with the social transformation. So even for the war, you show the different natures here. I'm not evaluating whether or not what's the failures, the tragic happens here, but we need to think about what's marked the difference between the 20th century and the 19th century. So as I said that, if you started from that traditional classical system, the theoretical arguments for the periodization 1870s as a demarcation between the old and the new, here in Asia, it's very difficult to make that distinction. However, if you look at these social mobilization, revolution, and the wars, then you can clearly see what's the demarcation or the distinction between these two centuries. China was born in this context in the 20th century. Because of this, the 20th century is probably not just overlapped with the history of one country, like the Soviet Union, as Hobsbawm said, but deeply related to the revolutions in the peripheral areas and its sequential consequences. To discuss the starting point and the ending point of the 20th century is to explore the multiple origins, tumultuous process, and the declining form of the revolutionary wave of this age. This problem needs to start with the analysis of the imbalance of the imperialist system. If the imbalance of the imperialist world system produces the weakest link, as Lenin said, of this international system, then the domestic division caused by the strong competition pattern also provides a weakest link for the domestic revolution, as Mao analyzed, which provides the condition for the survival and the development of Chinese revolutionary forces in the vast rural areas and the borders and the marginal areas of provinces during the Chinese Revolution. Rather than the establishment of the economic and the military hegemony of European or American capitalism in the 20th century, it originated from the new imbalance caused by this economic and military hegemony in the process of establishing itself, or more accurately, the revolutionary opportunity caused by this imbalance. That is, a series of major events with national revolution, political revolution, and a social revolution as the content. The Japanese-Russian War directly triggered Russian Revolution in 1905. That was the first Russian Revolution. I truly think these are the first revolution in the 20th century, which inspired the general strike launched by Polish Socialist Party and the Lord's uprising in June of same year, and influenced the Iranian constitutional revolution from 1907 to 1909, and the Turkish revolution from 1908 to 1909. These revolutions, together with the Chinese Revolution around 1905 to 1911, constitute the revolutionary sequence in Asia. So basically, we know that the Wang Hui, the first revolutionary organization, was established in 1905. And also the most important organ published by them, Lingbao, was also published the same year in 1905. So when I talk about the 1911 revolution, we can trace back to that early period as a sequence of the whole regions. So therefore, the birth of the short 20th century needs to start the search for weakest links, and the weakest links can only be identified by search for revolutionary opportunities. From the perspective of exploring the revolutionary opportunity, it is not the old geopolitical competition in Europe and Asia. Before we talk about the geopolitical competition between the powers, now we think about that the weakest link and the revolution. The revolutionary situation caused by the new pattern in Asia after the Sino-Japanese War and the Russian-Japanese War, not the imperialist wars, but the Asian awakening triggered by these wars and marked by the above-mentioned series of revolutions, which constitute the multiple beginnings of the short 20th century. Not single beginning, but a series of beginnings here and there. Therefore, in terms of time, the short 20th century didn't begin in 1914, as Hobsbawm argued, as many historians argued, but in the period around 1905 to 1911. In terms of space, it doesn't start from beginning, but from a group of beginnings. In terms of moments, it didn't start with the devastating war. It was born out of the due exploration of breaking through the imperial system and the older systems. Not only the imperial, but also traditional system too. So, from the perspective of geopolitical relations, the 20th century is not only a post-colonial era, but also a post-metropolitan era. That is, the revolution and the reform in the peripheral areas not only changed itself, but also changed the center-periphery relationship of the world. Now we are still see that the continuing process here, that not only the post-colonial, but the post-metropolitan process continuing now. And the all crises, contradictions happened in this process. And then had an important impact on the central area and the change. Today, this is also one of the prerequisites for the re-understanding the 21st century too. So in that sense. So, and also I would like to add one point. Russian Revolution, 1917 revolution. Most of observation was started from European history. That was natural and legitimate because basically Russian Revolution happened during the World War I. And the Bolshevik forced Russia withdraw from the war. That was the revolution happened from February to October. However, if you look at from 1905 and all these sequence, Russian Revolution could be thought as a second Russian Revolution, could be thought as one of the sequence of Asian revolutions. Basically, if you compare was the general thesis later, self-determination, and all these theses. It's talk about national independence. That was the topic and the theme of the beginning of 20th century. So in that sense, it's not only the reaction or response to the World War I in Europe, but also to some extent was the responses to the long sequential process of Asian revolutions. And in the world history, not only in Asia, too. So here, I will talk about something else. Here, I would like the synchronicity, because it's a truly fundamental change of the political thought. If you read the Chinese political treaties pre-20th century, they're all talking about the sage kings or Confucius, cite the early emperors or some sages to talk about, argue for the contemporaries. But now, in the 20th century, what they talk about for China, they talk about China for the reference to the Russian Revolution, French Revolution, Turkish Revolution, German Revolution, American Revolution, not mention the Meiji Reform. And they talk about the Boer War and the other India independence and all this colonialism and so on and so forth. All these discussions, it's about the future and the reality of China itself. So basically, the discursive change deeply reflected the historical change here. So now I talk about the last product, the politics of displacement and the replacement. The abundance of the horizontal relationships which exist are the product of the Spatial Revolution. As explained above, the birth of the century signified the great change amidst multiple temporalities, transforming them into the moments of unevenness within a shared temporality and bringing forth an absolute demand to view history from a horizontal axis. The horizontal movement of concepts, as well as their uses amongst the different historical temporalities, is indeed the most striking feature of the 20th century. In fact, this transformation of temporal synchronization takes the Spatial Revolution as its condition. Under the premise of the Spatial Revolution, temporally oriented relationships become increasingly horizontal. The great transformations of modernity, as well as the discourses used in describing them, cannot be narrated via a diachronically related guiding thread. Rather, their account must be derived from their multiple temporalities. When I describe these phenomena as a horizontal movement of concepts, these formulations' utility lies in articulate how, within a synchronic framework, historical content from different temporal axes is transformed into that which can be expressed in a single discourse. In other words, what is described above as a displacement can only be understood within the horizontal temporal relations created by a Spatial Revolution. Whenever these alien concepts are used under the historic conditions totally distinct from the conditions which originally produced them, then new consciousness, values, and moments are born. The birth of the new century means that the changes in multiple times are transformed into a synchronic internal imbalance, resulting in the absolute need to observe history from horizontal axes. I summarize these phenomena as a concept shifting, whose function is to transform historical contents in different time axes into the reality that can be expressed in the same set of discourse under the synchronic framework. In this context, how does politics happen? Without a series of brand new concepts or categories, the politics of 20th century and its historical meaning can't appear. And at the same time, however, if these translated concepts are regarded as a basic category to construct and explain the historical picture, the dislocation between the discourse system and the social conditions is often so obvious. In this era, the concepts of individual, citizen, country, nation, class, people, race, political party, sovereignty, culture, and society have become the central concepts of new politics. Production, mode of production, social form, and its affiliated concepts have become the basic category to describe China and other societies. The propositions of weakest link, the relationship between the enemy and ourselves, 敌我, all the regions, middle zone, 中间地带, three worlds, united fronts, and so on and so forth, all come from the judgment of global and the domestic situation and the strategic and the technical thinking under the imperialist condition. Among the above-mentioned main concepts, categories, and the proposition, except for new concepts and the categories arising from specific struggles, such as the border areas and the middle areas, most of the terms come from the translation and appropriation of 19th century European concepts and the propositions. However, the political content of these words or the concepts, such as state, sovereignty, people, class, citizen, and political parties, and so on, cannot be defined from their European roots. Revolutionaries and reformers in the 20th century quickly applied these concepts, categories, and the propositions to concrete political practice, but the historians in the new era were distressed by these phenomena, how to deal with these kind of phenomena. For example, if the category of feudalism originates from the complete misuse, a lot of people thought these are feudalism completely gone. That's 2,000 years ago in the Chinese history. How to define the social struggle labeled as the anti-feudal movements? So that was a lot of historians were frustrated by these phenomena. And what is the basis for the description of the social form before and after that? So for another example, under the background of establishment of European capitalism and the colonialist system, in the 19th century, socialists invented the concept of proletariat, which is regarded as a real revolutionary subject representing the future. That was Chakrabarti described that, how that the subordinate emerged, or the peasants, and so on and so forth. So many categories and themes in the 20th century China are repetitions of 19th century Europe. But each repetition is also a displacement, not only the product of background differences, but also a political replacement. Therefore, it is necessary to question the formation and the connotation of the categories of the country, nation, sovereignty, political party, people, class, and so on and so forth, to ask how the People's War transformed and created a new political organization and a state form different from the previous political parties and the states, and how to make farmers become the effective force or the political cause of the revolution through the organization and the mobilization. How to understand the sovereignty and the sovereignty dispute in the League of Nations and the war of the international alliance. In this sense, none of these categories can be explained simply according to the 19th century European logic, nor can they be explained simply according to their Chinese classical roots. These concepts reorganized the historical narrative and broke the dominance of the old narrative, thus paved the way for the development of new politics. This is not to say that there was no misunderstanding of concepts or the categories in the discursive practice of this era. That often happened, actually. But that without the analysis of political process of these concepts or categories, we simply cannot understand their true connotation, strengths, and the limitations. And thus, we can't understand the singularity of China in the 20th century through them. When these unfamiliar concepts are used in different historical conditions. They not only give birth to the new consciousness, values, and actions, but also produce the new political logic. Therefore, it is difficult to explain the significance of China in the 20th century without the inner version of Chinese Revolution. When I talk about the so-called inner version, not simply say this is only the Chinese version, because it's really, you need to put that into the social action. In those social moments, in the interaction, all these global links was localized in there. So that was what I talk about, the term of inner, certain kind of perspective. That was the perspective of activists in the different social moments. And still maybe 5 minutes? Sure. Okay. I give the last two issues, give some, one of the examples. We talk about I give the one example of like a sovereignty, political centralization. Here, I give the two examples. One is Karl Marx. Karl Marx talked about the bourgeois as through its exploitation of the world market, given a cosmopolitan character to production and the consumption in every country. Basically, he talked about the centralization of production, and as a background for the centralization of political centralization, the new form of the sovereign state, how that developed. How Carl Schmitt was also talking about the sovereignty issues. Basically, he tried to put it into the so-called the Spatial Revolution. For him, that started from the conflicts between the two systems. That was a religious conflicts, Catholic and Protestant. So when after the 17th century, after the Dutch, Britain, America, these constitute a new lineage of that, the whole knowledge. That was the so-called what he talked about, the Spatial Revolution, and to explain the new idea of sovereignty and the new form of the centralization. However, if you talk about China, you can see that the first of all, how to understand the idea of the state, because we know that there was a long idea of the state 2,000 years ago. Even the centralized state, the certain kind of form emerged. And after the 19th century, you still find different kind of the forms in the different regions that force the centralization for the internal contradictions within the last dynasty, and also some competitions with geographical, geopolitical competitions with Russian and the British India and so on and so forth. That caused, and the local rebellions against the central government eventually caused a new centralization process. It's a much more complex process. So in that sense, Chinese Revolution happened in such a great so-called a new the special conditions that were very different, defined from the perspective of Europe, but deeply related to that condition too. So on the one hand, you found a difference, but on the other hand, you found the close connections and the interactions together. So I will stop here for more discussions. Thank you very much.
So you mentioned in the Russian 1970 revolution, the national self-determination was one of the central theme. So you think because of this, the revolution might not only be a result of European intellectual society, but also be a consequence of series of Asian revolutions regarding national self-determination. I was just thinking that some people might argue, for example, Rosa Luxemburg might argue that this self-determination was just a wishful thinking of Lenin, who was born as a Russian and never really experienced as a member of nation being oppressed. unlike her, because she's from Poland, and Poland was a satellite country of Russia. So Rosa Luxemburg argues that like general people, folks in Russia and also in Poland, other ways, especially for socialists, they are not really very concerned about the national self-determination or the separation of Russia, Poland, and Baltic countries and Ukraine. It was just a thinking of Lenin himself that he believes through the theme of national self-determination could gain more support for Bolshevik party, and this might also reflect on the voting results of the Little Treaty, that how Lenin's ideas get oppositions from social revolutionary, from anarchists, from Bolsheviks themselves, also from the Russian nationalists. So I'm just thinking that this self-determination was maybe just an intellectual heritage of intellectuals instead of really representing any like folks' really interest. Like
these are huge debates issue that Lenin and Rosa Luxemburg on the one hand, and with Karkovsky on the other hand. You find that the different debates on that. And I think that that kind of debate can be traced back to the 19th century European socialist ideas. For Marx, that we know that how to find the solution for Polish question early. He said that the only solution was only happened in London rather than in Poland. Basically, he fought the proletarian revolution and also the socialist solution for the question of Polish question that was early. But then after the 1870s to 90s, and even 70s, even Karl Marx himself realized that the national question is not that easy. Only can be find a solution through the class revolution. So that's why he asked the Engels to study like Irish history. We know that there's a famous book by Engels that was talk about the Irish history, and also that the Cummington at that time talk about the self-determination. I found that the French translation of one document of Cummington in that period already used that term, self-determination, not only the Lenin's time. Of course, the self-determination can be used early, the competition for the empire, between the empires. It can be the fighting slogan by the empire against the other empire, like Ottoman Empire, and so on, argue for the frontiers, fragmented the old empire for their independence. For Lenin, he obviously demarcated, he tried to mark several moments. One is a Balkan crisis. Another, I think, later, it was first Chinese Revolution. So we know that his idea raised on the self-determination was published in 1915, right? So, but before that, he already made several times the reviews on the 1911 Chinese Revolution. Basically, he praised the CSS outline for the building the new republic and argued for that. Basically, Lenin's arguments is a plural, peripheral revolutions that need to pave the way for developing the agrarian capitalism rather than the socialism, however, through the way of socialism. That was Lenin's arguments for that. And in order to develop that agrarian capitalism, you need certain kind of the political rules, the forms. That was the self-determination in the state. That was later. Now, a lot of people disagree with this idea. In China, a lot of the critique of that. But basically, at that time, from my understanding, the slogan served as a value for the recognition of equality between the nations or the nationalities. So in the international arena, that was the slogan anti-imperialism. in the domestic the era, that was the anti-oppressed, the structure of the old empires. So that's why for the mobilized minority, different ethnic groups to join the revolution against the oppression. So in that sense, the idea of the nationality is a kind of displacement of the class in the context of the global structures. So that's why we continue to use that for self-determination. And even if you talk about it, we know that there's a famous arguments like the Luxemburg. I was really admire the arguments for that, more internationalist. But when I still remember that in the early years of this century, I visited my first visit to Poland. I talked to one of the authors of the charter, that the new charter for them. They talk about the new crisis in the neoliberal globalization. His answer to me is that basically the process could be thought as equal to the 1830s revolution, meaning that unfinished task of national independence. So that was, you can see that how the slogans continued to be the issue for those countries. I'm not so familiar with the Polish context, but these kind of the topic was still there. But obviously, Luxemburg's thesis can be used to rethink about the limits of that slogan, and especially the nationalism in different forms. I agree with that.
Okay, thank you for your wonderful talk. I have a very quick question. Like you mentioned that people were able to identify 18th and 19th centuries by means of 20th century, this concept. So I'm very curious how this concept, 20th century, still works in identifying 21st century, especially contemporary people's sense of time and space. So, in the early 1990s, there is such a kind of discourse like end of the history. So, 21st century is what, in your understanding?
Yeah, how we talk about the 21st century, it's to some extent, it's a kind of continuation of time, not as what we talk about 20th century, where Liang Jichao suddenly realized that it's the beginning of the new era. In that sense, we can also ask the question whether or not, on the one hand, whether or not the 20th century already ended. We are still in the sequence of the 20th century, or we are completely in a new era. That was another issue, because basically the idea of the 20世纪太平洋 20th century Pacific is a very special term for Liang Qichao and for his time, because before that we have no such kind of idea. But after in the 20th century, you have a lot of series of cultural revolutions, right? Man Force movement and so on and so forth, here and there, that these new consciousness of time or the new concepts became universalized. Actually, it's not only for China. The century was also started from 16th century, that idea from Europe, but the universalization of these chronicle was only in the 20th century, at least mainly started from 19th century, universalized in the 20th century. For example, in Russia was after the October Revolution, 1917. In China, 1911 revolution, there was a double system to chronology. And after 1949, that was the only one. It is a kind of new idea of the new consciousness. But 21st century is different in a sense. Unless the people trying to, like Liang Jichao, he trying to understand the new political forms, new technology, and a new so on and so forth. So in the 21st century, for example, some people will argue that the digital age is a new age. The competition within the digital space maybe another special revolution. So that could be thought as whether or not that was a continuation of 20th century, or it is something really completely different. It's still the question. That was we can think about this, the issue. Please.
Thank you so much for your talk, and your sharing of Yang Qichao's poem from 1903 helps me understand his 1902 experiment with fiction writing, the future record of New China, the 新中国未来记, which he dates it using the birth of Confucius, and then it's set 60 years into the future, so using the Chinese cycle of time. And even just the title, the future record, right? It sort of collapses diachronicity into synchronicity. The narrative frame in that novel is all about infrastructure. So the novel sort of arrives to readers in Japan because it's being sent over the telegraph at the same time. And it just makes me think of how important communications infrastructures are to the story that you're telling. Because if people in China weren't following the Boer Revolution, for example, in kind of real time, then it's hard to imagine that these sentiments and ideas would spread in this way. So I want to ask a question that's related to infrastructure. How does China's most recent major investment in building global infrastructure, the so-called 一带一路, One Belt, One Road, kind of fit into this? Is it a kind of continuation of this 20th century development, or is it something new? Is it borrowing from kind of older relations of communications and imperialism, or is it somehow resistant to that? I would love to hear you talk.
Big question. His poem is 1900.
1900.
All right, the 新中国未来记 1902. So that was the period. And before that, before I answer your last comments, I tried to, and inspired by your question, is that the idea of time for that actually contain a very strong sense of futurity. It's about the future. Talk about the contemporary. It's about how can we imagine the future and rethink about the reality and then the past. Why we need to reconstruct our early history as a prehistory to now. It's trying to rethink about the future. It's only the form of that. So that was, I think, that the why at that moment, it is a time when the Chinese people, especially those like Liang Qichao and the revolutionaries, reformers, strongly think about the future, not only about China, but also by the world. So these are, I think it's deeply different from what happened in Europe. Because why the idea of the century in that period became popularly used? Because of decadence, because the end of this, the end of the century, rather than the beginning of the century. However, there were parallel process. On the one hand, from like the 1880s down to the early years of the 20th century, those decadent ideas were and also some like a re-emergence of Baudelaire. Baudelaire was much earlier, became popular in that period. These are at the same time geopolitics as a knowledge expanded quickly. So you can find a double faces here. And so that's why I gave the urgency of the challenge at the same time to think about the future. So if you read that, it's interesting, deep crisis in China, but all the ideas is about the future. So they look back to the future. I think that these are conflicts. When you talk about the Belt Road Initiative, I think that we can trace back to that period. On the one hand, they try to argue the socialist idea, right? Later, the Chinese Revolution talking about the internationalism. But on the other hand, it's also China tried like Yang Du and the Liang Qizao's colleague strongly suggests that China should imitate the Western logic for build itself as an imperial country power. They predicted that in the future, the 20th century, by the end of the 20th century, maybe the whole country, that the whole world was only composed of a couple of big powers, right? So you need to build up big powers too. So these are kind of the competition between these two, two things. I have no the deep studies on the Belt and Road Initiative, but I think that the first of all, we need to rethink about the two things. The first is obviously it's very different from like the 1960s, like a Tanzania-Zambia Railroad. That was really the internationalist move for the supporting third world countries for their independence from the colonial imperialism and so on and so forth. But still, you can find some traces out there. If you visit Africa's and all that, like those medical teams in Africa now, still huge number of that. Every year you find the send of that. This is the one side. But obviously on the other side, that was driven by economic process, right? So you want to do the expansion of the markets and so for that. But what happened in 21st century and that period was that the colonial systems collapsed. The new systems were that basically the products of the 20th century. That's why we know that, for example, in the last part, I didn't finish my talk on the sovereignty issue. We know that the sovereignty is, to some extent, is a fiction. But on the other hand, to some extent, China became more respect for the sovereignty rather than other countries in many ways. Partly, from my point of view, partly because if you look at the Bandung tradition, started from the respect for the sovereignty for those third world or the southern countries. So all these kind of the business or something else was through this medium for that. This was really different from the colonial era. So this is a basic fundamental difference, I think. Historically, it's different. And I think that China was, on the one hand, is a contradictory body too. Because you have a lot of companies that followed the same logic or pursued the property and the wealth, right? So that's the necessary. They want to. So they follow the logic of global markets. But on the other hand, you also find that if you read the rhetoric, the summit, the Sino-African summit, and the statement, joint statement, they talk about the colonial legacy and the date issue. And China was the promise to reduction or the deduction of the date and so on and so forth. All these kind of, on the one other hand, looks like some kind of the lessons from the 20th century Chinese Revolution. So it's still try to define China as a part of the third world countries. So these are kind of the contradictory phenomena. It's here. So that's why I think that this issue was not simply positive and negative issue. Is that how can we launch to some mobilized this discursive power to show the possibilities for the future, more equal connections rather than follow the older logic and the so-called imperial and colonial and so on and so forth. So that I think that is my observation for that.
Thanks. So my question is, within Western Marxism, the concept often deployed to describe and explain spatial revolution and center-periphery dynamics is often uneven development or combined uneven development for those influenced by Trotskyism. And within that framework, there is a implicit temporal dynamic, but I think it's very different to the one that you have talked about today. I'm just interested in how you approach this concept as it's been developed. Do you think that there's something within it? What are your points of departure? I'd love for you to make that explicit.
Yeah, the related developments, like Trotsky's arguments for that. I think still to some extent, they're useful for that concept itself, because on the one hand, you find that all these were in the global process. However, some kind of the social conditions and the traditions remobilized into this new process. So that was also what I can talk about. That what I described as like a multiple developments in the horizontal relations together. So it's connected, but still you find the different trajectories for these. I didn't talk about these, and also the some contradictions emerged from this process. And as maybe if you allow me to show some here, when we talk about the sovereignty issue, for example, the revolution, because at that time it's still the national revolution. So you have to encounter what Pete described as the Carl Schmitt described the two hunters, right? The pirates, and the word from continental means the Russia and the Northwest European countries. But if it domestically speaking, you find that the different relations, multi-ethnic relations, and the traditional management, form of governance, old empire, all that being transformed and reformed for that. So on the one hand, you find that a lot of the national revolution for the equality and so on and so forth, that's very universal. But in the certain given conditions, you find a lot of the traditional techniques were employed in the whole process too. So you can see that the imbalance in not only global, but also inside of the country. So that sometimes I also use that term, but not as an analytical framework for that.
We have time for one more question.
I greatly enjoyed this talk, and I wanted to come back to the problem of the 19th century and the 20th century and so on, and just see if I've grasped the larger picture. I think that what's really interesting here is, okay, if I understood you correctly, the 19th century seems to stand in for a lot of the European ideals, especially as you mentioned with modernity, capitalism, and so on. And what happens with the 20th century is you get a resistance to this in terms of anti-imperialism, but anti-imperialism coupled with socialism. So there's almost a movement of the geographical center of history, right? So, but then what's very interesting in light of your own previous work is that then your whole rise of early modern thought, the large part of it is not about the century at all. It is about the non-century, right? Because it's not even, you can't even say it's the 19th century. So in China, you've got a huge non-century, but that huge non-century, I think if I follow your argument, is the condition for the possibility of the 20th century. And what we need to then understand is how we articulate that relationship, because it seems like you don't want to say that the 20th century emerged out of nothing, right? Because there's the non-century. It's on the one hand, a resistance to the imperialism, which is the legacy of the 19th century, you could maybe say. And then, but at the same time, it is the sublation of the non-century, right? The non-century, which is, so I was just wondering how that works. I mean, because on the one level, it seems like what you have, if the 19th century is modern, then the 20th century is almost beyond modern or postmodern, but that's not quite. Because what you're actually saying is that there's the realization of some of the ideals such as freedom and equality that are transformed. And so I was just wondering.
Yeah, this is also the very complicated question. First of all, we know that in the historical field, a lot of the scholars try to trace back to the early history in the different moments. For example, so-called the Tang Song transition or Mingqing transition, and so on and so forth, to find so-called early modernity. That in both the regional and the global context, that provide certain elements for later developments. And that can be, on the one hand, before, it was the components of organization of the general narration of the progressive idea of modernity. That was. But on the other hand, we see that these are only some kind of the historical moments, and it didn't directly were narrated in the framework of new idea of time and space, that the 20th century, for example, Pacific and so on and so forth. But in the 19th century, there was something really new. It's even traditional historical, it's especially in the Marxist historian will argue from Karl Marx himself, he pay attention to the Taiping uprising, for example. They found the new ideas of the redistribution of land. That was a very early period in the middle of the 19th century already. He saw that was kind of the signal of the new age. Of course, it is not talking about the 20th century. These are really from the elements. When I think about the 20th century, I think that because basically when we talk about the 20th century, and we actually talk about that the century after the 19th century, European centuries, that the two revolutions, the Industrial Revolution and the political reform, colonialism and the imperialism already spread over whole world. But I try to argue that, well, from more subjective perspective, I mean, the resistance means the perspective to think about that the century's issue, not started from static structure analysis, like a basic distinction between the different period of the capitalism, but try to see the historical moments that what happened there to these. And when I think about these, all in the global relations, that they can appropriate any kind of the traditions in different areas for them, for that. That's what, for example, Mao did, trace his revolution back to the Taiping uprising and to Wei Yuan and so on and so forth. All these became his prehistory of Chinese Revolution in the 19th century. That was happening there. He didn't use that. He just talked about after the Opium War. We remember that the periodization of that. And also in the actual process, for example, building, state building, Bolshevik state building, for example. On the one hand, they borrowed the socialist idea. If we visit the Jiangxi, even the structure, architecture structure, they used different ideas. But on the other hand, they truly learn from the some traditional knowledge for the management for that. And on the one hand, they used the most radical agenda for reform the traditional society. But on the other hand, they also try to employ some traditional knowledge, manage that social relations. I remember that one of the issue was the marriage law. I remember that we did publish an article in Dojo magazine, 马秀婚姻调解法, whereas the woodcut is a very famous woodcut, because still in the liberation areas, they transplant the most radical revolutionary marriage law. Argue that all the marriage should be based on love. Without love, it's immoral. So you have the right to ask for divorce. However, a lot of the revolutionaries, especially those leaders, immediately appear to that to get rid of their wife in the countryside. And they want to marry to some new woman. So these are the real question. So what happened to that period? That Ma Xiu was the judge. It's a highest court. He traveled. He not set up the court there. He traveled village by village, and visit family by family to negotiate with and the so-called the mediation or the 调解 in Chinese for the marriage relations, for stabilizing the family relations. It's also very important for the revolutionary government. Otherwise, the social chaos will happen, and so many phenomena. I give that example to see that how the radical idea in the concrete practice can be employed early knowledge and early experiments for manage these kind of things. They didn't abolish that radical law, but through these kind of practice and experiments based on the traditional social relations. And on the one hand, they didn't give up the radical kilos, let's say, but on the other hand, try to manage that for this. So these kind of things happened here and there in different fields. You can see in that sense, you can see that how that the kind of the relationship between the 20th century, the early history, the legacy.